This video examines mythology from the perspective of condensed symbolism. Initially, I had a very specific point in mind, but as I wrote the essay, it began to wander, from Scandinavia to Carl Jung and then Hindu mythology. Thus, I would like to categorize this video as a mental journey, a small hike, much more so than a directed and purposeful essay. I hope you enjoy. When it comes to mythology, there is an easy tendency to fall into reading the myths as works of literary fiction. The myth, in its pure form, is an ever-changing story, a story in which an entire people participates. But as cultures die or transform into entirely new and different cultures, their old myths become a relic of the past, a relic set down permanently, written down, and thus very stubborn, unable to change any further, because the people to whom that myth belongs are, in most cases, no longer around, or have chosen to discard that myth for an entirely different cultural narrative instead. An example of this that should immediately spring to mind for most is the Christianization of the Vikings. The Norse myths as an oral tradition were largely extinguished by the rapid sweep of Christianity through Scandinavia, mostly during the 10th century AD, and as many scholars still debate, the accuracy of what was written down by a handful of later Christian scribes can never be fully ascertained. Take Snorri Sturluson, for example. This 13th century Icelandic man of many talents is one of our leading sources for Norse mythology. Snorri is believed to have written the Prose Edda in the early 1200s. This text is the largest body of literature that we have when it comes to studying the Norse pagan mythological tradition. On the surface, it appears as an entirely valid account. Snorri was a man from the region. He lived relatively close to the time of those myths, and there is much in the myths themselves which aligns with the mythologies of other regions, indicative of a shared Proto-Indo-European ancestry. The narratives that Snorri recounts, at first glance, make as much sense as myths typically do, i.e. nowhere near as much as polished literary works of fiction. This is common to all mythology. Many moments, no matter how famed and iconic, happen seemingly for no specific reason. A certain Greek god decides that he must use an olive branch as a weapon, and without reading into this too deeply, his choice simply does not make much sense. And yet these stories don't just form this way. At some point there was a specific symbolic reason. And it is these specific symbolic ancient reasons which people even like Snorri himself often could not understand. When these misunderstandings are extrapolated through time, when the same exact myths are told again and again in the same exact way, they become nothing but stories. Every man knows of the binding of Prometheus, or of Loki for that matter, the flight of Icarus, or how Odin took his own eye. And every man knows of these stories in a small handful of versions that have been preserved. But in the reading of these myths, it is easy to forget that mythology primarily is the interaction of symbols in narrative form. These stories are secondary. To use Nietzsche's language, they are reactive epiphenomena. Humans need narrative in order to make sense of what is entirely symbolic. The myth is a processed product, in a way, a result of feeling and sentiment being condensed into symbols. There are several problems when it comes to Snorri and all other literary preservers of myth. The primary problem being that by the time literacy develops, myth begins to die. Perhaps the word die is not the most appropriate to use here, so let us say that myth is instead frozen and preserved. The signs of life are still there, but all growth and development becomes limited. After all, myths are an oral tradition. When the myth is active, it is shared between the people of a culture orally, strictly orally. Say your father was a warrior, an accomplished veteran of war. He successfully raided numerous villages in his earlier years and has felt true bloodlust. He is familiar with the adrenaline-fueled state of frenzy. You, on the other hand, are a young man, his promising son, and are yet to go to war. Your father is tasked with turning you into an effective warrior. Whenever he is at home, he trains you in the yard with shield and sword. Your technique has developed well. In fact, you have learned everything that you possibly could in this setting, but there is a major missing piece. You do not know bloodlust or frenzy, fury. Why? Because your sword-fighting partner is your father. He is not an enemy that you will ever cut down. He does not truly pose a threat to you. You might get hurt in the process of training with him, but in your heart you feel safe. You know very well that your father would never take it too far, and so any feeling of danger here is purely synthetic. Yet, the frenzied state that the warrior finds himself in during real battle is entirely authentic. It can only be brought about by authentic experience. In training with your father, you are missing a crucial piece, and your father knows this. With such a problem in front of him, how does he go about solving it? He primes you, i.e., he prepares you mentally. This is where the myth comes in. He will tell you a tale involving deities that you are well familiar with, how one god prepared himself for battle against that which posed a threat to the entirety of existence. In some cases, this god struggled, reflecting the human struggle of training, travel, physical and mental preparation for combat as a whole. But at one point, the god reveals his so-called true form and devastates his opponent. The god becomes so frenzied and furious that he begins to consume existence around him. He thus becomes a black hole at the center of existence. Because the world cannot continue to exist while he is in this consuming form, the god reverts back to his regular form shortly following his triumph. Most mythological traditions have some variant of this tale. Now, it is easy to read this kind of story and take it for what it is, that ancient people believed in a set of deities on another plane capable of world-breaking activity. When a certain god is enraged, we observe thunder. When another god is saddened, we get rain. These often come together. One god is weeping at the rage of another. Think of a father who is screaming and a mother who is crying at the same time. However, myth does not function like that, at least not entirely. Whether there truly is another plane of deities who are waging great war does not actually matter here. What does matter is the psychological effect this has on man. Let us return to our example. The father who tells his son of a frenzied god in battle is doing so in order to establish a psychological base, a foundation. He is preheating the oven, so to speak, so that it is ready for when the actual cooking begins. The father, as a man with experience, is aware that a certain feeling takes over the warrior during the peaks of battle. It is a totally consuming feeling. Nothing exists but the individual. Everything that comes into contact with this frenzied warrior is either destroyed or entirely discarded as unimportant. Hence the black hole, the world-destroying parallel of myth. The adrenaline coursing through the warrior's body gives him superhuman strength. He feels himself larger than his opponents, stronger. Nothing can hurt him. In fact, the numerous injuries he may sustain during this moment are barely even noticed. Cuts, tears, and so on. Even an arrow wound, perhaps, depending on whether it hits a vital organ. Once victory is achieved, however, the adrenaline begins to reduce, and the warrior returns to a much less frenzied state, the normal, rational state, i.e. the god turns back to his human form, because the frenzied form is biologically unsustainable. Once again, you, as the young inexperienced son and aspiring warrior, are simply unfamiliar with this feeling. The closest you could possibly come is being aware that such a feeling exists and will come over you eventually. The easiest and most effective way to prime you for such a moment is to instill in you a narrative, a grand, inspiring, symbolically rich story of the deities you worship and what their experience was like. Thus, a young man going off to battle for the first time anticipates and is excited to relive the same tale as that of his god. He will too momentarily become an all-consuming, frenzied black hole. He looks forward to this, and once he experiences it, he understands how difficult it is to put such a state of being into words, especially in a culture which is not literate, and thus he rehashes the tale he heard from his father, the tale you heard from your father as he trained you, and the tale is adapted to your own experience. Perhaps you are already married when you go off to battle, and you return to your wife and conceive a child in celebration of your victory and continuing life. Thus your retelling of the frenzied god myth gains a new, tiny epilogue. Once the frenzied god destroyed his enemy, the world again bloomed with flowers, i.e., one of the symbols of fertility. Extrapolate this myth-telling process to an entire culture with many different subjective rationalizations of what is generally the same biological state, and you end up with an extremely rich and constantly evolving body of mythological tales, among which certain symbols stand tall, very tall, all interconnected by the subjective narrative links of each individual experiencer. Considering the specific case of Christianity, these myths simply fell out of favor. Christianity scorned bloodlust. The second greatest commandment, Matthew chapter 22 verse 39, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Christian man is immensely different to the pagan man. The religious myth of the pagan is mostly incompatible with Christianity for various reasons, and as the Christian man begins to write and create archives, he archives myth as well. Let us look at Snorri Sturluson again. He was a Christian. His worldview and understanding of history was Christian, i.e., biblical. Pagan mythology, however, is at odds with the biblical account as well. And yet this is still Snorri's culture. He cannot reject the entire history of his culture. No honest man can, no matter how at odds it may be with what he himself believes in his current day. And so, 300 years after the Christianization of Scandinavia, Snorri decides to record what he knows of his cultural history, once again as a Christian. Earlier in this essay, we stated that Snorri was relatively near to the time of Norse myth. On a historical timeline, he was much nearer to the myths than we are. However, 300 years is still an immense amount of time. It may go by in a flash, but in terms of history, several centuries have passed. If you were to ignore modern technology and academia, how much credence would you give to a story passed down through your family for 300 years? How much would that story change due to simple errors of memory? What are the chances that some ancestor of yours slightly exaggerated some part, or, once again, simply forgot some important detail? If we are to estimate a generation to last 30 years, then 300 years is 10 generations, i.e. 10 chances for the story to become distorted in some way. Now let us take this even further. Say there are 3 variants of the same story, but only one of them was written down by an ancestor of yours, and this is the only story that eventually survived. Does its survival mean it is by any means accurate? Absolutely not. Does this written down version allow for change, for a dynamic interpretation that mediates between the other 2 forgotten versions of the story? Not really. Hence the tale is no longer living. Hence the tale was frozen. Snorri Sturluson did exactly this. 10 generations later, he recorded what came down to him. Do not get me wrong, paganism always was and always will be alive in certain corners of each region, but Christianity was dominant by that point. The myth was for the most part a cultural relic to be documented, because man eventually begins to document everything. What Snorri understood, he wrote down to the best of his ability. Certain parts of mythology live on as parts of culture, stripped of their religious weight. Other parts, ones that were by that point already too foreign for the Christian Snorri, he interpreted through a Christian lens. The most popular example of this is his treatment of the deities. According to Snorri, Odin was a human. He was wrongly deified by people who were still ignorant to what he considered to be the Christian truth of one singular god. In fact, Odin and several other Norse deities were simply heroes from the Trojan War. Their great feats of war were praised and glorified by countless generations, with each generation elevating these alleged humans more and more, until they became gods in the eye of the Norse people. Snorri, convinced of the self-evident Christian truth, as he saw it of course, simply could not understand how people could believe in all these deities above the one true God. If we are to take this deeper, Snorri did not understand that the deities are personifications of certain states of being, like the state of frenzy and fury in the case of Odin. We will return to this in a moment. It must be stated, however, that the work of Snorri is still extremely valuable. Until recently, the theory that Snorri's work is entirely washed through by Christianity had a significant amount of followers. Thankfully, due to the efforts of individuals like Dr. Jackson Crawford and many others in recent years, this theory is no longer as reputable. At its core, the Prose Edda is still profoundly pagan, and the keen adamant eye learned in the Christian canon will be able to discern where Snorri relates authentic pagan mythology and where he introduces his own Christian elements. Nevertheless, Snorri is guilty of yet another misunderstanding, this time a highly symbolic one: the nature of the World Tree, Yggdrasil. A quick first-time reading of Snorri's Prose Edda is very likely to leave one thinking that the Norse people genuinely believed in a massive tree of which the visible world was simply a part. Granted, some may have actually believed this and nothing more, with nothing symbolic behind it, just as some Greeks did truly believe in deities dwelling on Mount Olympus. But generally speaking, this was not the case. The separation of myth from reality for ancient people is a difficult subject in general, but a succinct way of putting it would be to say that both the cosmic and the literal interpretation could exist at the same time. The trees on our planet grow toward the sky. Man also grows toward the sky. So why would it be wrong to assume that in the grand cosmic order there is also an ascending tree, or something akin to a tree? Something that can be described as resembling a cosmic world tree. It has roots, it has branches, all of them point in different directions of the totality of existence. The tree symbolizes everything that the world is, both growth and permanence, elements under and over the ground, the softness and changing colors of the leaves akin to the changing moods and nature of man through the seasons of his life. Man is eternal and ever-renewing, just like the 1,000-year tree, and yet man is constantly dying, as individual trees too constantly die. There is arguably nothing more suitable as a symbol for existence as a whole than the tree. The Norse are not the only peoples to treat the tree as a symbol. Slavic paganism, while infamous for its difficulty to properly ascertain anything, still retained the world tree in the Slavic cultural memory. The Mirovoye Derevo. Its branches, trunk and roots also symbolize the different elements of what is otherwise the totality of existence. It is probably safe to assume that in the Slavic oral tradition, an immense majority of which has been lost, there were most likely myths about some certain character as a personification of some negative state, attempting to destroy this tree. But the eternally renewing, cyclical nature of the tree itself always prevailed. In Central Asian shamanism, the tree plays a major role as well. It is a cosmic bridge between all states of being, from the lowest, i.e. dead spirits, to the highest, meaning celestial deities. The shaman is skilled at navigating this tree. This does not mean that shamans were good at climbing actual trees, or that they considered themselves to be climbing some specific tree during a ritual. The tree is a symbol for the mental state of finally understanding that every plane of the universe is connected by the phenomenon of life itself. After all, trees are also alive. What we have just said is only touching the surface of the deep, deep lake that is tree symbolism. However, for Snorri, the world tree, Yggdrasil, is more so a massive tree that his ancestors believed in. He attempts to map its roots and branches geographically, to specific realms, even though other sources remain extremely ambiguous on this. Snorri, of course, was not an idiot. He understood that this is a mythical tree, that no such real tree exists. But what he fails to understand is that it is a mythical axis. The tree is a key by which a worldview is to be unlocked. It is foundational to viewing life in a certain way. It is a symbol which evokes profound sentiment, and in order to transmit this symbol effectively, it had to be turned into narrative form by those who lived within the oral tradition. In his 1936 essay titled Wotan, Carl Jung posits the Norse god Odin as an archetype, a force that is capable of seizing the collective unconscious of a people. He is of course personified for the purposes of sharing this symbol between men in convenient narrative form, but ultimately, Odin is a stand-in for a psychological state of being. Jung uses the term ergriffenheit, a state of being seized or possessed. Both of these words can elicit a somewhat negative association, especially the word possessed, due to its usage in Christian language. In the past, one was often possessed by the devil. However, what Jung means here is the overpowering of man by profound feeling, whether negative or positive. One is possessed by a gaspingly beautiful view after a long climb up a mountain just as much as one is possessed by rage. The god Odin, then, is an ergreifer, one who seizes, one who possesses. He is an ergreifer of men. He possesses them. Jung goes on to state that a mind that is still childish thinks of the gods as metaphysical entities existing in their own right, or else regards them as playful or superstitious inventions. But the gods are without doubt personifications of psychic forces. Psychic forces themselves have to do with the realm of the unconscious. This is followed by Jung stating that a surface reading of the myths arises due to man's fear of the metaphysical. Anything that doesn't come from the visible world must be rationalized again and again until it does appear to have some form of visible source. Even if it means that these mythological symbols, which are so representative of our deep psychic forces and states of being, turn into imaginary deities that live on some other cosmic plane. Popular portrayals of Odin, in part due to J.R.R. Tolkien's popularization of the wandering wise elder character type, have him pinned as the one-eyed wandering god. It is to Thor that the role of anger and aggression belongs now among popular depictions. Unfortunately, this is simply not in line with the tradition. It is a distortion which results from the aforementioned process of freezing a certain version of a myth by writing it down and allowing it to stay cemented, while the other oral versions die out. This is not to say that J.R.R. Tolkien is the sole individual responsible for a current propensity toward the wandering elder archetype. Such things take centuries to form. The great William Morris, 100 years prior to Tolkien, was also part of this process, and much more importantly, there was Richard Wagner, the famous 19th century composer. In his Ring of the Nibelung, in the Siegfried portion specifically, Odin is now the Wanderer. This is the name of the character. He has given up on ruling the gods, and is soon to entirely retreat in favor of curating his wisdom further. This isn't out of line with certain mythological portrayals of Odin by any means, but it is heavily skewed, one-sided, and the Wanderer became memorable, while the furious, frenzied Odin faded out of popular memory even further. In the 11th century AD, a certain Christian chronicler, Adam of Bremen, wrote very simply, Odin is fury. In fact, there is a wide range of historical information that alludes to ruthless human sacrifices for Odin. Odin was thought to be both the cause and manifestation of war and all its associated brutalities. In short, Odin was thought to be bloodthirsty. If we are to interpret this symbolically, we could say that for the Norse people within the oral mythological tradition, bloodthirstiness and frenzy were important to maintain. The Norsemen were warriors, after all. In Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, we find the following in Aphorism 260, quote, Odin placed a hard heart in my breast, says an old Scandinavian saga. It is thus rightly expressed from the soul of a proud Viking. Such a type of man is even proud of not being made for sympathy. The hero of the saga therefore adds warningly, he who has not a hard heart when young will never have one. Why would a people celebrate having a hard heart, and attribute this gift to the head of the pantheon, if not due to the fact that a certain cruelty and bloodthirstiness as a psychic force was important to their life. Odin is not the only furious god. Turning to the Indian Vedas, we find another very similar example to the fury of Odin, and to the fact that Odin has two forms: the human, wise, elderly form, and the grand, furious, all-consuming form which man can barely ever behold. It is important here to remind you of the father and son example we used earlier, how the father tells a tale of furious transformation to his son in order to prime him for the bloodlust that he should experience once he is in battle. Additionally, it is important to highlight the fact that the Vedas of India and the Eddas of the Norsemen have a common ancestry. They are both Indo-European. As we stated earlier, variations of such frenzy can be found in almost every localized Indo-European tradition. In the Sanskrit epic Mahabharata, which contains the Bhagavad Gita within it, there is an ongoing rivalry between two groups within a dynasty, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Their war takes up more than a quarter of the epic and is a setup for the Bhagavad Gita itself. This portion of the book is rife with symbolism, as is the entire epic. Centuries and centuries of generations have dedicated their lives to the study of this monolith. What is of interest to us is an episode that occurs in the 6th book between the divine-born hero Arjuna and his chariot driver. As the warring parties are ready to clash on the battlefield, the so-called region of the Dharma, the great warrior Arjuna looks over the scene and is quickly overwhelmed by the feeling that this war should not happen. The people fighting are all related to each other. Quote, fathers, grandfathers, teachers, uncles, brothers, sons, grandsons, companions, fathers-in-law, and friends. Arjuna informs his chariot driver that he will not fight. He lays down his bow and arrow. The chariot driver, in turn, admonishes Arjuna for having a weak and miserable heart. He must fight, lest he be labeled unworthy of being a man. The chariot driver goes on at length on the value and honor of being a warrior, the duty and responsibility that comes with it. But as he speaks, he delves further and further into rather esoteric topics. Eventually, he reveals himself to be a cosmic lord, who is here to restore cosmic order. Arjuna is quintessential to his own aims. The chariot driver is in fact the god Krishna. Everything he has lectured Arjuna on is thus the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord. Krishna alludes to the fact that he has infinite manifestations. The chariot driver is simply one of his human forms, and so Arjuna asks him to reveal his majestic, supreme form, his imperishable self. Krishna agrees and grants divine vision to Arjuna so that he is capable of fully perceiving this supreme form. The parallel of Odin sacrificing an eye for cosmic vision and knowledge is also worth pointing out. However, what follows is a description of what Arjuna saw. Quote, with many mouths and eyes and numerous wonderful aspects, with multiple divine ornaments and raised divine weapons, it bore celestial garlands and robes and was anointed with divine perfumes, composed of all marvels, godly, infinite, and facing all directions. If the light of 1,000 suns rising at once were to appear in the sky, it might resemble the splendor of that great soul. Arjuna saw the entire universe with its various divisions concentrated there in the body of the God of gods. Arjuna is awed by this image, the entire cosmic order unveiled in front of him, and soon he begins to panic as he observes that Krishna's numerous mouths, infinite mouths, devour men with great fire, and not only men, but the world itself, all of the worlds. Here we get the famous quote from Krishna, I am time, the world destroyer, ripened, and here I am busy crushing the worlds. Arjuna, absolutely overwhelmed, begs Krishna to revert to his human form, the chariot driver. Krishna abides, and the teachings continue. It goes without saying that there is much more to be discussed here. Libraries of books have been written on this part of the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata as a whole. But what is of use to us today is the parallel between Krishna's transformation and the ancient two-sided portrayal of Odin. This is not to say that a 100% parallel should be drawn between the two, but moments of similarity cannot be ignored when it comes to symbolic expression. This tale of Krishna's transformation is helpful in making sense of how Odin can be both a wandering elder and a furious, bloodthirsty god at the same time. When a state of frenzy is not required, both Krishna and Odin take on a human form. An elder who either gathers knowledge obsessively, as all humans do, or spreads this knowledge to the most suitable individuals in order to further his own cosmic aims. And yet, knowledge is only one aspect of the totality of existence. And perhaps we could argue that one who has true knowledge of this totality, i.e. of life amid ceaseless destruction, of every single thing being born only in order to die, cannot help but take on a frenzied state to get ahead of this destruction and become the destroyer himself. If we were to attempt to make any sort of point with this essay, it would be the following. Take care not to forget that ancient myth is symbolism laid over narrative form. Every detail matters, and every detail came about as a result of something, of some subconscious psychic force or element. The objects displayed in myths, while often nonsensical, do have some meaning behind them that we more often than not are somewhat oblivious to. Every symbol that is unlocked through the study of mythology bears with it a significant portion of an older worldview, of an older subconscious. Whether this subconscious has remained the same for us humans in the modern day is up for debate. However, someone like Carl Jung would argue that these ancient symbols and the forces they represent are still very much alive. In his eyes, many answers to modern psychological phenomena are still locked away behind the symbology of the ancient myth.